Hey everyone, it's Ben from Board to Bits, and welcome to part 28 of our series on making a custom character controller in Unity. So up to this point, for the past few videos, we've been using this controller switcher as sort of this manual way to switch between our walking controller and our vehicle controller, just to make sure that everything's working properly. But what would be nice is if we could actually control which controller we're using in-game. But which in particular, what I mean is that I would like for our walking controller to be able to walk up to the vehicle, kind of interact with that vehicle, and that will kind of get us into the vehicle and start being able to drive that around until we want to exit. So in order to do this, we have a little bit of a system set up right now in terms of our interact object, which if we go back to our model scripts here, we see it here. I can open this up. Interact object that has this interact script that then currently just kind of changes the color of the object in question. But this is basically what we want, is we want to, we create a hitbox that checks if there's an interactable object around and then kind of calls on this interact script on that object. Makes sense. And so what we could do in theory is we could make this something like a virtual or abstract method and then kind of have things inherit from interact object when we want them to be interactable. Makes a lot of sense. However, there's a little bit of a problem with this, because if we want to make our vehicle controller interactable, we can't actually inherit from the interact object because we are already inheriting from controller. And we don't necessarily want to kind of embed this into controller, because then every controller has to be an interactable object, and it gets kind of muddy, and unfortunately you can't inherit from two separate things at once. Fortunately, what we do have here that we can work with is something called an interface. And if you're not familiar with interfaces, I'm actually going to get into it a little bit more in depth in a Unity 101 video in the future. But for right now, just suffice to say that an interface is kind of like an additional kind of label you can put in addition to whatever you're inheriting from, that just kind of guarantees that, hey, there's going to be a method or methods of a certain type in this object as well. So how we can create this is in our model scripts folder here. I'm going to right click and create a new C# script, and I'm going to call this capital I and then another capital I, and that for interactable. So I interactable, which kind of looks like it's a misspelling, but when you're creating interfaces, it's generally best practice to put a capital I at the front of the name, just so that if someone is looking through quickly, they can see, oh, that's an interface and not an actual class. So we're going to open that up in MonoDevelop. Zoom this up here. Let me zoom in a little bit more here. That's probably too much. One back. There we go. So in here now, we're going to change this from public class to public interface. And we're going to get rid of this mono behavior inheritance. We don't need it for an interface. Lastly, we're going to get rid of both of these methods that are currently in here, and instead we're just going to replace this with not even really a method, but just kind of the structure of a method. We're going to say void interact, and this one doesn't have any parameters. You can return other things if you want, and you can have parameters. However, if you do either of those things, anything that implements this interface is going to have this specific structure. So right now, our interact object has void and no parameters, and you can, once you're implementing it, you can make these public, but you don't actually make it public in the interface. But suffice to say, so this right now would technically be all you need to properly implement IInteractable. In fact, we can do that right now by saying, in addition to inheriting from mono behavior, you add a comma, and then you say IInteractable. And so now we know that this is both a mono behavior, or it inherits from mono behavior, but it also implements IInteractable. So we want to do pretty much the same thing inside of our vehicle controller. So here, once again, we're going to add a comma and say IInteractable. And then what this means though now is that we have to, in fact, if I jump back over to Unity, we should see, let me see here, yes, this error comes up, that vehicle controller does not implement interface member IInteractable.IInteract. And that's because we don't have this method inside of our vehicle controller. So it's yelling at us saying you're not actually implementing it. You're just saying you are, and it doesn't have that knowledge. So what we can do way down here at the bottom, I'm actually going to add this, is we can simply add a method. I'm going to make this a public method and it's going to be public void interact with no parameters. So same exact idea as what's in our interact object and our iInteractable. And all this is going to do is say when you interact with the vehicle, you're going to activate its controller. So all we have to do here is say activate. And now our vehicle is ready to actually be controlled. Now there is one other thing we need to do in our vehicle controller, and this is kind of a failing on the part of how my interact structure is right now. It worked for when we were just kind of showing off like how to do interacting versus attacking, but this is something I'll probably optimize at the end of this series. But remember that when we had this interact object, we needed to make sure that the game object layer was on layer 9. And this was because of how our hitbox checks to see if it can actually collide with something or if it's being triggered, is that it kind of sets its layer and then we kind of see which layers can interact. So we do need to make sure that we're putting our vehicle controller on this layer. So I'm going to actually copy this line, game object layer equals 9, go into my start function, and just make sure that that's in there. The last thing we need to do, and this is also kind of a gotcha, is right now if we were to play our game and I would have the walking controller walk up and try and activate the vehicle, it wouldn't do anything. And that's because how our walking controller works is that when we go to interact, it activates its hitbox, which is run by this player hitbox script, which then that kind of runs the show. So let's open that for a second and see why this wouldn't work right now. If I scroll all the way down here, on trigger enters where we check and see, oh, I'm colliding with something. Should I interact with it? Well, what we're checking for right now is it an interact object? And our vehicle controller isn't. It inherits from iInteractable, but it is not actually an interact object. So we need to make sure that our hitbox isn't looking just for interact objects, but for anything that implements iInteractable. Fortunately, this is pretty easy to do. All we have to do is say get component iInteractable. And now that will work just as promised. This will actually both work with the interact object because it implements as well as the vehicle controller. So that's pretty cool. So now we can go back over to Unity, and now if I hit play, we should see if I've done everything properly here. I can walk around. Here, I'll even highlight my player hitbox here. See me walking around. I can activate the hitbox with the Z key. You'll see it lighting up. That means it's being activated. I'll zoom this out a little bit even. But now if I walk over here, and now I'm overlapping with the vehicle, I hit Z now, and now I'm in the vehicle, and I can drive around as normal. It's now the controller that I'm working with. So that's great. The only problem is that now I'm in the vehicle, I have no real way to get out. I can use the controller switcher, but that's not what I want to do now. Now I want to do this in the game. If I were playing this game right now, how would I get out of this vehicle? Well, if you recall, when we first set up our vehicle controller, we had our main button, our space bar, is our accelerator. Our secondary button, the Z key, is for braking, and we're going to make that third button, the X button, for exiting the vehicle. And so now that we have all this set up, we can actually kind of build out that functionality. So I'm going to stop this game here, jump back over, and we can do this all right inside of our vehicle controller script. So the first thing we need to do is create some way for the vehicle to know, oh, when you're exiting the vehicle, what controller should you switch back to? Our controller switcher was just switching back between two arbitrary controllers we chose. Now what I want to do is say, oh, what's the controller that's walking up to me and getting into the vehicle? We're going to jump back to that one. So we can do that pretty easily. Right here in our current vehicle states, I'm going to add one more, and it's going to be a controller. It's actually not really a current vehicle state. I'm going to break it out a little bit. It's just more of vehicle, we'll call it passenger information. And this controller I'm going to call exit controller. And all this is going to be in charge of is saying, when you exit the vehicle, what controller do I pass you back to? So with that information, we can now pass that in when we activate our vehicle. So when we go down here to activate, remember that in our base activation, we deactivate the current controller, and then we set our passenger model to be active, in addition to making sure that our camera is right and all that. So before we actually get rid of that previous controller, I want to log it in and say, oh, this is the exit controller. This is the controller that we should exit back to when we're done. So I'm going to say, before we do the base activation, I'm going to say exit controller equals input manager.ins.controller, because that's what's keeping track of what the current controller is at the time, right before we swap it out for the vehicle controller. So that tells us now, oh, when we exit, go to the exit controller. Now what we need to do is actually give this exit method to say that the exit controller should reactivate itself when we exit the vehicle. This is also pretty easy. I'm just going to say void exit, and then our exit controller will activate itself. And that obviously goes through the process of deactivating the vehicle for us, so we don't have to worry about doing all of that other stuff. The very last thing we need to do is actually set up the button to say, oh, when you press that third button, it should exit the vehicle. How am I going to do this? I'm simply going to copy the structure we had for the brake button. I'm going to change this to be the exit button. Make sure we're looking at button index 2. And when that gets pressed, we will call on our exit method. And that's all we really need. I can jump back over to Unity now. I'll hit play here. Again, I'm walking around as normal. I press the Z key to get into the vehicle. I can accelerate in reverse, I can brake, and then when I hit the X key, I pop out and I'm back to my walking controller. So I can get into the vehicle, accelerate, and then with the X key, jump out of the vehicle. So that's really all the functionality that we were looking for here. Now we're able to, with our own in-game controls, be able to switch between controllers and really get the full breadth of the different elements that we interact with our game with. And this is really going to lead us into our final part, which is our flying controllers, because we're going to use a sort of like a power-up or a pickup in our world that we can interact with that pickup, and then that will give us the ability to fly. So that's what we're going to be dealing with in what is the last leg of our video series here, other than some smaller optimization stuff at the very, very end. But yeah, this is the end of the vehicle section of our program, and thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.